Okay, so that little beep there was the starting of the recording. We're going to try to record this, something I've been doing and putting on YouTube. So if you miss it, or if you want to go back and look at something that we said, you can go do that. Today we're going to talk about something called the argument from reason. The argument from reason has been championed by various people like C.S. Lewis, Alvin Plantinga, and Victor Reppert. Okay, so last week, if you were here, and even if you were not, we still did this. If you were here, we talked about the worldview implications of naturalism. So what does it mean if there is no God? And we talked about several different points. The universe is unplanned, the natural world is a brute fact, and the fine-tuning that we observe from science is defeated by the multiverse, which basically means there is a nearly infinite number of universes out there. There's no meaning, hope, purpose, or destiny. There's no afterlife, no objective morality, no evil, no free will, no rationality or thoughts, no grounds for belief, and no justice. Now, I didn't make any of that stuff up. All of that stuff, all these points I took from what non-believers said about the way the world is if naturalism is true. And these, of course, are all foundations of a worldview. So you can put together a worldview on the basis of naturalism, the idea that there is no God and no other thing except for the natural world. What we're going to talk about specifically today is, first of all, the fact that we evolved from lower forms of life. And second of all, we're going to focus in on this idea that there's no free will and no rationality or thoughts specifically. Before we get further, I just want to make another point about the Reason Rally. It's the same point I made last week, but it's worth repeating. The Reason Rally is billed as the largest gathering of free thinkers in the U.S. All right, so in 2012, a bunch of atheists, secularists, etc., depending on how they label themselves, generally free thinkers, gathered at the National Mall in celebration of reason. Then the irony is that these free thinkers who say that reason is good, and they ascribe to a worldview that implies there's no free will, so how can they be free thinkers? There's no thought, so how can they be thinkers at all? There's no good, so how can reason be good? And there's no reason anyway, right? So all of those things are implications of a naturalistic worldview. So it's just kind of funny that they would label themselves free thinkers and champions of reason. Anyway, I just wanted to put that out there because it has very specific relevance to the thing we're going to talk about tonight, which is the argument from reason. So to put it simply, the argument from reason basically starts with this. So if naturalism is true, then everything about us is fully reducible to particles bouncing around. Because of that, everything is deterministic. Particles bouncing around does not allow for rational deliberation. So you can't take some evidence and look at it and think about it and decide whether you think that makes sense or not. Because you can't decide anything. You have no free will. So therefore, we have no reasons to trust any of our reasoning capabilities because we're not actually reasoning. All of our responses are determined by the laws of chemistry and physics. So if we have no reasons to trust our reasoning capabilities, that is, if naturalism is true, we have no reasons to trust any evidence in favor of any position in particular. So any evidence that we come upon, and we say, well, this is evidence for God, or this is evidence for atheism or naturalism, we don't have any reason to trust any of that evidence because we can't deliberate on evidence, i.e. there is no reason. And specifically, then, if naturalism is true, we have no reasons to trust any evidence that claims naturalism is true. Therefore, if naturalism is true, no argument can rationally be put forth for naturalism, or anything else for that matter, right? But specifically for naturalism. In other words, if you believe you have rational capabilities, you have reasons to reject naturalism. So proponents of this argument, C.S. Lewis, and I would like to get a volunteer from the group to read this out loud. Yes, go ahead.
All possible knowledge depends on about validity of reasoning. If the feeling of certainty which we express by words, like must be and therefore in a sense, is a real perception of how things outside our own minds really must be, well and good. But if this certainty is merely a feeling in our own minds, not a genuine insight into realities beyond them, if it merely represents the way our minds happen to work, then we can have no knowledge. Unless human reasoning is valid, no science can be true. C.S. Lewis, the Miracles.
So C.S. Lewis, if you don't know who he is, was a very eloquent proponent of Christianity. And basically what he's saying here is that if the things that we think in our minds do not correspond to the reality outside, then we have no reasoning capability. And if we can't do that, then we can't do science either. So here is Alvin Plantinga. Volunteer? Yes, Derek, thank you.
Evolution and naturalism are not merely uneasy bedfellows, they are more like belligerent combatants. One cannot rationally accept both evolution and naturalism. Naturalism seems to lead to a deep and pervasive skepticism that leads to the conclusion that our cognitive or belief-producing faculties, memory, perception, logical insight, etc., are unreliable and cannot be trusted to produce a preponderance of true beliefs over false.
Very good. So what he's saying here is basically on naturalism, since we can't trust our minds, then we have to doubt everything, including any of the evidence in favor of naturalism. Victor Reppert is another proponent of this argument. By the way, I accessed this quote from infidels.org. So anyone want to volunteer for this one? Yes.
Proponents of this argument. According to theism, the universe is a rational place because it is the creation of a rational being named God. Reason is, so to speak, on the very ground floor of reality. However, anyone who hopes to defend atheism needs to assure us that an atheist universe can house within itself the necessary conditions of logical inference. The simplest way to generate this kind of argument against materialism is to say that since all thoughts are determined, apart from pure quantum chance, by the motion of atoms in the brain, it follows that such a process cannot be a rational inference.
So basically they're all saying the same thing. Now it's not these guys were all theists, but it's not just theists who are saying this. One more volunteer? Yep.
Hostile witnesses. My mental processes are determined wholly by the motions of atoms in my brain. I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true. And hence, I have no reason for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms.
Very good. Very simple, succinct. This is the argument from reason in a nutshell right here. Last one. Charles Darwin. Yep.
With me, the heart of doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind?
Very good. So I hope you guys have gotten a good feel for what this argument from reason is. So before we do that, we are going to also unpack so we talked about naturalism a lot, but also we kind of folded evolution in there as well. So here's the idea. So the question, this actually arose out of an argument from the atheist side, which tried to solve the problem of why humans are so oriented to belief in God. So some people have even called our species Homo religiosus, because we just seem to really have this propensity for religious belief, right? And so that's been a question, especially among atheists who think there is no God. So why would we, in the world, would our species be oriented in this way? Now, of course, the Christian answer would be that God has made us and made us in His image and put Himself in our hearts at some level, right? So but the question the answer coming from the non-Christian or non-theist point of view would say that evolution selected for this. So here's the idea. So way back when we were all cavemen, we basically, whenever we encountered a difficulty in life, the cavemen and women who happened to believe that there was some spiritual power out there that was helping them, they survived better. Or another way to put it is that if we somehow ascribed some agency behind the things that we came upon, like, oh, I see something moving in the distance, I think that actually is some individual over there, be it an animal or another human that I may want to avoid. We detect agency in things, and that helped us survive, even if that was false, right? And so because of that, we've evolved naturally this propensity for seeing agency behind things and for also thinking that God is behind all things, right? But this argument proves too much, Because if evolution is supposed to select in favor of survival traits, right? This is why we all have that propensity, is because we all came from people who survived because of that propensity. Then that means that evolution doesn't select for truth. It selects for false beliefs. Well, if evolution selects for false beliefs, and we are so tied into that is such a part of our identity that we can't even tell the difference between true and false beliefs, then how in the world can we tell whether or not evolution itself is true? Right? Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at this video, which I think this is a very entertaining video, and I think it sums up this idea of the argument from reason. Let's go ahead and get to some of the discussion here. So how could evolution be expected to produce truths in our thinking, right? Because what we've been talking about and what that video talked about was that, apparently evolution doesn't select for truth. But how could it, right? Because maybe it does, right? So there's some ways, obviously there's a response from the non-theist side, which says, no, evolution does select for truth. So how could this happen? And so let's go ahead and have a discussion. What I want you guys to do is for a couple minutes, pair up, group up, you guys discuss things together, reach across the aisle, introduce yourself to someone. Anyone want to volunteer on something that you discussed, maybe an answer to this question? Volunteer. Yes, Forrest.
So, you mentioned, okay, you can have some beliefs that are false.
Yep.
They can still help you survive. For example, the pigeon with it believes it has
Okay.
wings.
Right. Yes, right. So actually we will get to that question in a second, but what I want you to discuss is what are the ways in which evolution produces true beliefs, rather than what are some counterexamples to how evolution could produce false beliefs.
Right.
Okay, sure.
So, while that may be the case, and you're a bird, you won't jump off a bridge.
Right.
Right? But you may end up eating some berries that are poisonous to people, but not to pigeons. But you think you're a pigeon, you eat them anyway.
Okay.
So, if you have a tendency to believe things that are false, you would pretty much die off.
Okay. All right. So right.
Things that are true, and thus you would eventually believe in.
Right. So you would say generally, true beliefs
Would help you survive more than false ones.
are better for survival. Okay. Perfect. Okay. Anybody else? Yes, Curtis.
Why are beliefs needed at all?
Okay,
Because
that's
the
interesting.
best system would be one where you just reacted by reflex, and the reflexes were suited for survival. You don't need a notion of good or bad or false or true to survive. It's a topic.
All right, so reflexes or instincts are better, is what you're saying. Okay, that's interesting. Yep.
I guess I might have pushback, but what about someone differences on what causes survival?
What do you mean?
So the old lady that keeps smoking, she doesn't believe that cigarettes are gonna kill her.
Okay.
But I don't know, a young millennial who believes cigarettes kill people. Wouldn't survival be based off a belief rather than a reflex or an instinct?
Okay, so your point is that maybe beliefs do matter because you could have long-term effects that aren't based on reflex or instinct, right? And in fact, if it was just based on instinct, you might want to go back to the tobacco that will eventually kill you. But you don't realize that because instinctually you're like, hey, this is pretty good stuff. Okay, that's interesting. So,
Would that kill off all those people so that they would reproduce, so that you'd be left with the people who instinctively stay away from it?
okay, so the idea, okay, so right, so we have some interplay here, right? So instincts, so beliefs help for long term. But then the flip side again to that is that, well, you don't have to form that belief if you instinctually know to stay away from the tobacco. All right, okay, that's interesting. But basically what we have here is that So even if we're not talking about beliefs, if we're just talking about the way we think, or I guess from your perspective, the way we react, is that evolution can select for these survival benefits that can have truth, can correspond to the truth of the real world, right? Okay, and I think these basically capture in a nutshell the way that someone would respond to this evolutionary argument against naturalism. The argument from reason. And I think Forrest hit it pretty well on the head in the first bullet point, which is well, generally, if you have a belief that's true, then that will be better for your survival, because otherwise, if you have a belief that's false that just happens to be better for survival, then that's just random. Okay. All right. Well, can you think of examples where survival is not equal to truth? So, I mean, I guess the video suggested that the guy thinks he's a pigeon with wings that don't work, so he won't jump off the bridge, right? So that's one. Anyone can think of another one. Actually, we'll have another discussion. So you guys start talking, and we will bring it back together in about a minute. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Let's hear it.
I was going to come to the first thing that comes to mind is like when you're setting out to do something, don't crush your eyes and stuff like that.
Okay.
Exaggerate.
Okay. All right. So then, so it's basically when you're told an exaggeration by your parents, right? And the example is don't cross your eyes, otherwise they'll get stuck like that. That's not true, but it helps for survival because it could hurt you to cross your eyes a lot.
Yeah, or like
Don't stick your finger in a socket. Okay. All right. Yeah.
One simple example might be like you say hypothetically you have this primitive, not prehistoric, but this primitive culture of like men, women, and children that think that if they plant like certain seeds in a certain area where like the soil god or the sun god lives,
Uh-huh.
then like the crops that they obtain from growing those seeds are good in that particular area at that particular time. And if they go anywhere else, then it's not, like, it doesn't grow at all. And they think it's like correlated to the fact that this idea that the soil god or sun god lives there has something to do with it, with the actual crops actually growing, but in fact it's because the soil is better or the conditions are better.
Okay, good. So this would be something I could call a primitive religious belief, right? So if you have a primitive religious belief, then maybe you're believing something about the god of fertility blessing your crops, but only in that particular location, and that's not true. But what's really true is that location is just a fertile soil. But they also believe that if they try to plant their seeds inside of rocks, the soil god will not bless those seeds because he doesn't favor rocks, right? Okay, yeah, and so, and this is the whole basis for the idea of the evolutionary argument against naturalism, which is kind of a branch of the argument from reason, which says that, look, if you think that evolution supports the formation of religious beliefs because it helped us, then, hey, these things aren't true, right? At least according to the naturalist, right? So primitive religious belief may be like a rain dance or something like that, Okay, good. Anyone else? Yeah.
You might see your friend eat some kind of plant, get sick and die, and come to the conclusion that all plants are poisonous, and just you would survive, you would avoid all of them as plants.
Okay.
It wouldn't be true that all plants are true.
All right. So that would be a belief that all plants are poisonous. Poison. Oh man, I'm not drawing this very well. Poisonous because one plant was. So you eat only meat, which a lot of college students do anyway. So, okay, good. So I think I'm going to skip this one, right? On naturalism, how can we trust our cognitive faculties in light of some examples that we came up with where survival is not equal to truth? And I think the answer to this that would come from the other side would say, well, you know what? Yeah, so on in some cases, evolution will not select for truth; it selects for survival, and those things aren't necessarily the same thing. But on par, it does a pretty good job, right? So it does a pretty good job. We are like Forrest said, generally true beliefs will aid survival, and if a false belief is aiding survival, it's just by chance, right? There's no rhyme or reason to it. Okay, so let's just keep going. So, so on that note, isn't it enough to think that we can at least trust some of our cognitive faculties? So what's happening here is that evolution is selecting for survival, and not all the time, but most of the time, that corresponds to truth. Isn't that good enough, right? So let's go ahead, and I want you guys to discuss that idea just for. Is that Will? No? Curtis? Hunter? Okay.
It's a circular question.
Okay, it's a circular question. Okay.
So they're asking you to think about thinking.
A circular. You guys can't read that question. Circular question. They're asking us to think about thinking. Okay, that's interesting. I didn't think about that. So, all right.
How is it like the reasoning is circular or the question's leading?
They're assuming you can trust your thoughts, and that's the very question.
Okay, so that's a very good point, right? So it's assuming, all right, or they. So let's say they. So we're going to do othering language here, right? They, those guys over there, they assume you can trust your thoughts. Trust your thoughts. But that's what the question's about. That's an interesting point. Questions about. Okay, anybody else? Yeah.
How would you know which ones you can trust?
So that's a good point, right? How would you know? How would you know which ones to trust?
It's like evolution left you with no.
It's not like evolution left you a note. Very good. Yes. Very true. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so even if it did leave you a note, how could you trust the note? That's a good one. Yeah. All right. Good. So, anybody else? Yeah.
We talked about how like different situations call for different properties.
Okay.
So, like if you want to experiment on something and see if it produces the same result time after time,
Yeah.
you would use the scientific method. But if you have the result you only want to method, you have to use forensic science and the methods. So if you only trust one or the other, you can only pick those into evidence in these situations.
Okay. So that's okay. Good point. So different experiences require different faculties. And the example was the difference between experimental science and forensic science. Okay, very good. So here's what I would say about this. And I think the idea of the second bullet point here, the idea that it's a circular question, is really hitting on it. So this is the problem, right? So when a naturalist wants to argue against religion by saying it was a formation in terms of a socio-biological evolutionary concept, and they're conceding, therefore, that evolution doesn't necessarily always select for true beliefs, they don't apply that to themselves. Because you cannot step outside of your own cognitive faculties to judge your cognitive faculties. And the other problem is that the idea that's so deep-seated in evolutionism, which is the worldview that all we are is the product of evolution and nothing else. What's so deep-seated in that is that we are such a product of our evolution that we cannot control anything else outside of ourselves except for what's been selected for inside us by evolution. So if evolution is selecting for false beliefs, how in the world can we ever step outside of that? Not just step outside of our cognitive faculties, but step outside of who we are because of evolution in order to judge anything. Okay, so this is the idea of the robot rationality that we talked about last week if you were here. And again, even if you weren't here, we still talked about that last week. So if we are made solely of particles, how do we deliberate on correct versus incorrect? This is the idea that we don't have any free will and no deliberation. All of our actions, beliefs, and decisions are outputs based on the inputs we received and the programming of our nervous system. How could evolution, which is the process that wrote this code, ensure the accuracy of this programming? Right? And that's the basic problem here. But there's more. So C.S. Lewis has this argument from reason, and it's not just on this idea of evolution, right? It's more subtle. So basically, his argument asked about how the physical configuration of atoms and electrons in your brain could correspond to a non-physical idea. So think about that. If you can think, right? So maybe we can't think at all. But that's a thing, right? That's the very question. So you have you're composed of these particles, right? How can a particular arrangement of the atoms in your brain and the electronic configuration, how can that result in something that's non-physical? It can't, right? So basically, any thought, it has two parts, right? So there's a physical part, which is the neurons firing, and if you're a naturalist, you want to reduce everything down to that. But it's just a physical process. But then you have the other part, which is intentionality, right? We talked about this last week. That's the non-physical part. That's something called, it's called intentionality. It's what has often been described as the aboutness of something. Now, this is the idea, is that physical objects cannot have intentionality. They cannot have aboutness. Like I said last week, this table cannot be about Hawaii. I could show you a picture of the Empire State Building, but that's not really a picture about the Empire State Building. It's just a particular configuration of light on a screen. And the screen is scattering the light, and you can see that light because it's impinging upon your retina and your neurons are picking it up. But it's not really about the Empire State Building. Right? Our discussion really isn't about the argument from reason, because our discussion is just sound waves and neurons firing, and those things can't be about anything. You can't have a physical object that's about something else. It's just an object. Yes?
To counter that, wouldn't say that you really don't have intentionality, that's just an illusion?
Yes, so that's exactly true. So naturalists would say you don't have intentionality, it's just an illusion, which then leads us even further down the rabbit hole of absurdity, right? So, if you don't have thoughts that are about anything, in other words, if you don't have thoughts, what is there left to discuss even, right? So if some naturalist comes up to you and says to you, I think I don't have thoughts, what are you going to say to that? Like literally, you cannot step outside of yourself and judge Christianity, but not judge yourself by the exact same standard, right? You can't step outside yourself if what you're doing is trying to make yourself doubt the very thought processes that go on inside your brain. So, okay, so how could these two parts correspond? We'll just skip that one because we're running out of time. So here's the thing. So our thoughts, which have meaning, can and do correspond to reality. But on naturalism, this is a really big problem because, like I said, our thoughts don't have meaning. They're just neurons firing, and they don't mean anything. In fact, the quote that I'm going to show again by Alex Rosenberg, it basically says, hey, look, I wrote this book about how thoughts don't have meaning, and neither do the sentences on this paper. It's absolutely absurd. It's fantastic. We'll get to that, right? So we have no reason to trust that our thoughts correspond to reality. We cannot get outside ourselves for an independent test. And our thoughts actually don't even have meaning anyway on naturalism. And that's just a big problem. And so this is C.S. Lewis's argument. You have something that's physical, and it has to correspond to something that's non-physical. But on naturalism, it can't, because there's no way you can connect those two. So there has to be something that's non-physical about us. Okay, so here's the quote. This is from Alex Rosenberg. He is the philosophy professor. He is a philosophy professor, and I think at one point he may still be the chair of the philosophy department at Duke University. He's an author of a book called The Atheist Guide to Reality. So this is the quote. The meanings we think are carried by our thoughts, our words, and our actions are just sandcastles we build in the air. We can accept that brains convey this information in sounds and inscriptions that confer the illusion that there are propositions that give the content of the sentences speech and writing convey. Right? So just to back up, we accept that we can convey information that can that's basically an illusion, that the sentences, the contents of our the sentences of our speech and writing actually have content to them, right? So it's an illusion that the things we talk about, the things we write, it's an illusion that those things carry meaning and content, right? And that goes for all the sentences in this paper. All right, so this is actually not, I don't think this is actually a quote from his book. I think this is a quote from an interview that he conducted, right? So thinking about things can't happen at all, because there can't be anything called intentionality. There's no aboutness. So you can't think about a thing. You might think you're having a thought about it, but you're really not having a thought. So it's pretty wild. All right, when consciousness convinces you that you or your mind or your brain has thoughts about things, it is wrong. So I wonder how he thought about that. I mean, it's so absurd at the base of it. And this is this is what's going on, right? So, but we're nothing but the firing of neurons, right? So according to Dr. Rosenberg, our thoughts can't be about anything any more than this table can be about something else, because our thoughts are just material and material causes. And the idea that our thoughts are about something is an illusion. It's an illusion. So how would you respond to this? Let's go ahead and skip that. We're running out of time. So actually, one very quick response to this is, besides the fact that it's on the face of it absurd, and if anyone tries to convince you that this is true, I don't even know what to say, right? I mean, okay, you do say this one thing. Okay, so our thoughts, the idea that our thoughts are about something is an illusion. So we're experiencing an illusion that is about the idea that our thoughts are about something. What is this illusion about if there's no such thing as abouts, right? So to even make this argument, you have to draw upon the worldview of Christianity, which says there is intentionality. That's why, anyway, okay, moving on. All right, so this is what the blogger says, and I've said this like so many times in the past couple of years in these two presentations, because it's so awesome. Okay, so he says, my jaw dropped when he read these quotes, right? I gasped in disbelief at the sheer irrationality of his truth-denouncing proclamation. But then I thought to myself, well, perhaps somewhere in Wonderland there is a University of Jabberwocky that offers PhDs in advanced theoretical nonsense, where the reality of truth and the truth of reality is denied, a place where the deception is honored and the blind learn to lead the blind. Sadly, I'm afraid this is the kind of thinking that more and more people in the upper echelons of the intellectual community seem to be enamored with. It seems that the mark of excellence is the ability to think illogical, self-refuting thoughts, and then to proudly write a book about having them. So, this guy's a brilliant writer. But it's so true, right? I mean, what do you even do if someone comes up to you and says, I think that I cannot think? Now, the problem is that this is exactly where naturalism leads you. If you believe naturalism is true, how do you get away from that conclusion? There is no way to avoid that conclusion. It is the exact, it's the rock bottom foundation for naturalism. That is exactly where you have to go. You cannot avoid it. Right? You can delude yourself into thinking that is not what my worldview tells you. But again, you know, if that's true, then David Wood has a bridge to sell you, right? Okay, so just a couple more things on intentionality. So C.S. Lewis and others argue the fact that our physical mental states cannot be about anything. And if that's true, that means there can be no correspondence between a physical state and an intentional state on naturalism, right? So on naturalism, you're stuck between two places. If your brain is purely physical, your thoughts cannot be about anything. But you actually do have meaningful thoughts, but these cannot be reduced to matter, right? So on this idea, you can't hold these two positions together on naturalism, right? So human conventions such as money, language, and ideas cannot be reducible to the matter in our brain because they are non-physical entities. So I'm not talking about money physically, I'm talking about the idea of money, fiduciary, right? And then language and ideas as well, right? So just to summarize, okay, so this is the end. Our thoughts appear to have two parts, the physical and non-physical. On naturalism, only the physical are possible. That's a typo there. Let's go ahead and just cross that out. Let's pretend like that's not there. Okay. So there are no intentional states, thus ideas and thoughts are meaningless. evolution is cited to rescue this correspondence between the non-physical and the physical. Right? So evolution programmed us to have true beliefs, basically. Right? But evolution does not necessarily promote true values and beliefs. And as long as it doesn't promote them across the board, how do you know that any one specific belief is true? Especially if we are such the products of evolution that we can't get outside of ourselves. Right? So our thoughts are meaningless, do not necessarily correspond to reality, so one cannot adopt naturalism on the basis of rational thought. In contrast, the Christian worldview does not have these problems, right? We are rational beings made in the image of the one who grounds rationality. Our minds are won over by the wisdom of one who became foolish for us. So just a couple quotes. That's from Mark. Actually, Mark, Matthew, and Luke all have this quote. It's from Isaiah chapter 1, and Romans 12. Yes, question? No? All right, that's it. Any questions from the crowd? No? Okay, that's good. That means I did a good job.